Book 1, Chapter 7. Alone. Martin had been home precisely 1 month. He had missed 5 birthdays in the time he'd been frozen. 5 years of his young life had been taken from him. But he'd not grown an inch in his cryogenic state. Dr. Fraser had explained that he would experience quick and often painful growth spurts. But for now he was very much the boy that had been put under the gas so many years ago. Monica and Henry had decided to throw a party for Martin. They had originally planned it for the day that Martin awoke, but they knew that he would not be well enough for some time. So they rescheduled the festivities for the time they knew he'd be able to leave the bed, and then the house. They had kept this plan a secret. Initially, Monica had thought David could be trusted with the information, but why risk it, she thought. He'd be no assistance in the planning anyway. Henry had called the families of Martin's friends and shared the good news of his boy's return. The boy had suffered 5 years of coma and weeks of isolation. Now they wanted to help him get back on the path from which he'd been disturbed, to bring over friends that he hadn't seen in years. The events of the prior night did cast a gloom on their festive plans, but they had no intention of canceling. Monica's eye had not been damaged, but the brow had a small cut that had bled sufficiently to put a scare into them both. Henry had been so mad that he wanted to take the mecha back right then and there. But Monica had managed to keep him in the bathroom until he calmed down. "Don't let this ruin Martin's birthday," she had told him. She didn't know how she felt yet, but she was grateful that the wound hadn't been grave. She was not only grateful for herself, but there would have been no way to keep Henry from returning David. Or, in his anger, perhaps worse. She felt uneasy when she thought about the way he'd shaken David, and the way he'd glowered at David's pathetic keening. She hadn't seen the man she loved in those cold eyes. That morning, Monica had snuck David away from the bedroom while Martin was still sleeping. She'd given him her own special mission. The mecha had been overly apologetic and so eager to please her that it had broken her heart. She took some boxes out of the closet and told David that these were for his big brother's birthday, which they were going to celebrate today. His job was to put the toys together. She'd taken him down to the big room beneath the house and shown him how to wrap presents. As usual, he'd mastered this process after watching her do it just once, and he had immediately started wrapping the pile of gifts on the table before him. Monica had also given him a special toy. It was the newest thing from Cybertronics. "This is a Smart Ranger," she told David. "In a couple of months, every kid in the block would have one, but Martin would be among the first. This is going to be your present to Martin," she explained. "I want you guys to be real brothers," she'd said. "But no more sneaking around at night," she'd scolded. He'd promised her he'd never do that again. "What made you do that?" she asked him. David's eyebrows pinched at some inner conflict. Martin had tricked him, yes, but he'd known he should not have gone into the room. In the end, it was his responsibility. "I wanted a lock of your hair, like in the movie," he replied. Monica eyed him carefully. He was learning how to fib. She changed the subject then. She asked David if he understood the Smart Ranger's instruction pamphlet. He'd shown her how easy it was for him by whizzing through the form quickly. Then he went to work putting the present together and wrapping it in a box. Monica knew that Martin had something to do with what had happened the night before. She could have forced David to tell her what his role had been, but she let it go. Maybe this would be some type of bond between them, their little secret, so to speak. She hadn't been hurt, just scared. It wasn't too late to start over again, to give it another try. But when she confronted Henry after leaving David to his task, she found a second chance wasn't going to be an easy sell. Martin was in his bedroom. Mom had asked him to stay there while she took care of some things, she said. He was sure he was in for big trouble, but the trouble never came. The mecha had apparently not said anything. Then Martin had heard his parents arguing about David. Dad wanted to return it to Cybertronics immediately, but Mom told him it was out of the question, that she would not allow them to destroy David. She said that he was part of the family now, and they weren't going to kill him just because he was having problems adjusting to his new human feelings. Dad had said that kill was an inappropriate word, but Mom had inquired what other word was appropriate for taking someone's life. Martin was curious about what feelings Mom had been talking about. Did David have real feelings? Like people did? Like he did? He was listening carefully, but Dad had closed the bedroom door. Undeterred, Martin leaned on the wall and pressed his ear tightly against it. Though somewhat muffled, he could hear every word his parents spoke that way. He learned something then, something about David that he'd not known. It was something that he'd suspected, but hearing it was still a shock to him. David had not really been meant for him at all. It wasn't a toy. It was an imitation son. Dad said that the imprinting was a new procedure, and there could be flaws that Cybertronics didn't know about. So that was it. Now Martin understood everything. David was some project that Dad had brought home to test for the guys at work. Martin suddenly felt like a selfish and errant child. He'd almost ruined his dad's test, and in the process could have hurt his mother. He had a sudden impulse to apologize. Imagine saying you're sorry to a mecha. But David wasn't around. He was doing something for Mom down in a storage area. Maybe later, he thought. Maybe. He put his ear to the wall again, but Mom and Dad had gone downstairs and out by the pool where he couldn't hear them talk. It's normal for little boys to feel competitive and jealous, Monica said, as she was placing utensils on the tables around the pool. Henry followed her, annoying her. Martin's only been home a month, and it's normal for brothers to challenge each other. Henry placed a few shoots of balloons on the grounds around the tables. He was getting tired of her rationalizations. He wondered just who she was trying to convince. He was playing a game. He made a mistake and... Monica paused. He's practically human, she concluded. That's not how he looked holding the knife, Henry suggested. Scissors, Monica corrected quickly. It was a weapon, Henry said. Here we go again, Monica thought. One of the most basic rules from mecha was that they couldn't harm their human owners. This was programmed. Any mecha that harmed a human was automatically shut down and destroyed. Was this Henry's new strategy? To claim that David tried to hurt her and have him shut down? David was just a little boy. So what if he was a mechanical little boy? He would never try to harm her. She fixed Henry with an impatient glare. Why do you keep imagining he was purposely trying to harm me? She asked. Because we don't know the answer to that, Henry said. He put the balloons down and confronted his wife. How is it worth the risk to you, or to Martin, or to us as a family? I will not let you take him back, she roared. Her anger silenced Henry for a moment. You told me what they would do if you took him back, she said, and went to finish the decorations. Henry was quiet for a moment, looking for the right words. He continued cautiously. Think about this, Monica, he said. David is a prototype, the first and so far only of his kind functioning. Even the people who built him don't know all the possibilities. He was created to love, Monica. Love. That's an entirely new thing for a mecha to deal with. If he was created to love, then it's only reasonable to presume he knows how to hate. And if pushed to those extremes, what is he really capable of? In spite of her anger, Monica found herself listening to Henry's reasoning. She thought about the night before. What had she seen then? It was just a little innocent boy trying to compete for his mother's love. Right? What else could it have been? She narrowed her eyes at Henry. He was manipulating the situation, trying to get his way. That's all. Without a word, she pressed a box of party utensils against his chest and let them go. He caught them quickly before they hit the ground and watched her storm into the house. Monica didn't want to deal with this right now. There was a party to prepare for. David should be finished wrapping the presents by now. She had to get him prepared, too. The guests had to be told that David was not to be discussed outside the house. But this should be no problem. They were all Cybertronics employees or friends and relatives that could be trusted. Then she heard the hearty laughter of young boys coming from the front of the house. Damn, the first guests were already getting here. Martin, she yelled. Martin was perplexed at the large boys who smiled up at him as he made his way down the stairs. When Mom had called his name, he'd expected that some type of punishment was finally being exercised. But instead, who was that? Was that? Oh my God, that was Todd. What was going on here? Hey, Dork, get on down here, this bigger version of his friend yelled. Jock and Philip were there too. And who was that other kid? That was Gotam. He had been smaller than Martin before. Now he was... Martin was in shock. For the first time since he'd been awake, the weight of his lengthy hibernation came down on him. But it was soon lifted as his friends surrounded him. There was so much catching up to do. New bands, new fads, and girls. And what was this they'd been told about a little brother? Other guests were arriving too. A small group of cousins, aunts, and uncles, followed by Grandma Swinton, who came all the way from Little California and planted a big wet kiss on Martin's cheek. The guys all snickered at this, and Martin made a return gesture when none of the adults were looking. There were a lot of people from Dad's work, too, and they were all interested in seeing the Mecca. But Dad seemed annoyed at the idea and waved the thought away. He said it would be around later, that they should all go out to the party area and relax, enjoy themselves. Down in the storage room, David had finished wrapping the presents. Mommy came to see him. "What a beautiful job, honey," she said. She was genuinely pleased. She sat him down then and looked at him seriously. "David, you have to be," she wanted to say, "careful. Good around Henry from now on. You can't do anything like what you did last night, ever again. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mommy," David said meekly, his hands held tight in his lap. He was the picture of a little boy's innocent regret. Monica stared at him intensely for a moment longer. His eyes were different in some way. Was it this competition with Martin that was changing him? Or was there something else? She pinched his nose then, and he smiled. Then she handed him a colorful pair of swimming trunks that she had bought while she was shopping for Martin's presents. She knew from reading the manual that David couldn't go swimming, that he'd sink right to the bottom. But she figured that he might as well fit in as much as possible. "David, these are for you," she said, and then helped him out of his clothing and into the new swimwear. "Some of Martin's friends are here today. You should try and get to know them," she said. "Try to play with them and learn from them." But even as she said this, she knew that David was never going to change from the emotionally vulnerable little boy he had been programmed to be. He was smart enough, though. He'd find a way to fit in. She gazed at him, her little robot boy. Her life was so much better since she'd awakened his love. She had so much to thank him for. But now she had to attend to her guest upstairs. She ruffled David's hair and kissed him gently on the forehead. This was the last kiss that Monica would give David in her life. "Happy birthday, Martin," David said cheerfully. He knelt next to the poolside where Martin sat, looking forlorn, watching his friends splash around in the pool. David had brought Martin the Smart Ranger in the box he had wrapped like Mommy had told him. "I made this for you," he said, hoping that Martin would try and be nice today. Martin had been feeling distant and left out. His friends, now grown beyond him, played freely in the pool. Their healthy bodies and inexhaustible energy made him envious. He wasn't even allowed to go in the water yet. His body wasn't strong enough to swim. He looked up at the Mecca when it addressed him. He wanted to be mad at the thing, but it wasn't really the Mecca's fault his mom had feelings for it. It was just a robot, a toy. It was just doing what it was programmed to do. The thing didn't even seem to understand the differences between them. Martin smiled weakly at David. It might not be so bad having a little brother. Hell, he might even get along with it someday. At least he could try, if only for Mom's sake. "So this is him. This is your little brother." It was Todd, swimming frantically from the volleyball game, which was rapidly dispersing as all the kids came to see Martin's new toy sibling. "Well, technically, no," Martin replied dismissively. Todd crawled from the pool and appraised David excitedly. The heavy-set boy's face was red from exertion, and he splashed water all over Martin and David as he crawled from the pool. "He's Mecca," he said. "What's Mecca?" David asked. The term was new to him, as was the boy who said it. David had not met any other boys like him and Martin. This boy was bigger than both of them. His stomach was all puffed out, and his voice was more like a man's, like Henry's. "We're organic," Todd said, pointing a finger at his own chest. "You're mechanical," he finished, pointing a finger at David. "Get it? Orga, Mecca, Orga, Mecca." The big boy walked around David as he repeated this chant. Other boys were swimming over now and getting out of the pool. Soon David was drenched in water as he became the center of attention. Martin reached out and grabbed Todd's arm. "Stop it!" Martin commanded. Mom had asked him not to let his friends make an issue of David's differences in front of him. But Todd was unstoppable. The guy hadn't changed that much after all. "I didn't even know they made little kids," Todd said, continuing his inspection of David. Philip had come out of the pool, too, and stood drenching wet while he eyed David with an anxious curiosity, wondering how accurately these things were built anyway. "Can you pee?" he asked finally. David knew pee. That was waste disposal. David produced no waste to dispose of. "I cannot," he replied finally. "Then let's see what you can't pee with," Philip said, reaching for David's swimming trunks. David didn't have any inhibitions, because he had no understanding of embarrassment. He had no idea what the big boy wanted to see down there, and made no move to stop him. Martin quickly slapped Philip's hand away from David's trunks. "Cut that out! Come on, what are you, a perv or something?" David looked curiously at Martin when he did this. Was the big boy's actions wrong? Martin glared back at the mecha, wondering why in the hell it wasn't defending itself. Philip snorted. "It's just a doll, man. What's the big deal?" The other boys snickered. Todd reached out and touched David's shoulder. "Feel it, man. It's creepy," he said, running his hands over the robot's smooth shoulder and down its back. David did not understand the boy's actions, but he was not being hurt, so he did not object. The other boys quickly joined in, gathering around the mecha, pressing, pinching, and squeezing its skin. They oohed and ahed at the real feeling of David's skin and hair. Martin didn't know why this annoyed him. He'd done the same exact thing a few weeks ago. But some strange bond had developed between him and the robot. He didn't really mind this so much, but if the boys got out of hand, he'd put a stop to it. Suddenly, David understood what they were doing. They were having fun with him. Wasn't this the tickling? David knew tickle and made the appropriate response. The boys all jumped back as the mecha erupted into a strange laughter. It was a better simulation than when he'd first arrived, but it still sounded odd and mechanical to Orga ears. Across the pool, some of the adults had become curious about what all the kids were fascinated with. Was that the secret mecha they'd heard so much about? The boys looked curiously at David. What a dorky-sounding laugh. Some of them snickered and walked away. Todd just rolled his eyes at the sound. How phony. Martin was slightly embarrassed for David, but glad that the big deal was starting to subside finally. He was gladder when David finally stopped the weird-sounding laughter. It was too bad there was no program for how to chill out. Todd knelt in front of David and started running his hand up and down the robot's smooth inner arm. It was so real. There were even veins in there. "Does he have DOS?" the boy asked. "What's that?" Martin asked, not really wanting to know. He just wished he'd leave the poor thing alone. It couldn't help it if it was stupid. "DOS, damage avoidance system," Todd responded, as if everybody should know. "It's a pain alert system, so they won't go picking up fire with their bare hands and stuff. Our serving man has it." And he knew that very well. He'd had plenty of fun making the thing go into alert mode when Mom and Dad weren't around. He thought it was hilarious watching the old sim run frantically from a pen prick in the ass or something equally as harmless. Todd looked around him. There was a table near the remains of the cake. Ah, there's what he was looking for. He grabbed David by the wrist and walked him over to the table. The mecha followed without resistance. The other boys crowded around as the adults slowly began to gather on the outskirts of their circle. Todd was always good for a laugh. Martin sighed and bowed out. If the dumb machine didn't even have enough common sense to protect itself, he wasn't going to get involved. Todd picked up a large cake ladle and turned to David. "Listen, I'm not going to cut you," he said, holding the thing up for David to see. "This is not going to hurt." He pressed the blade against the soft flesh of David's inner arm. "This won't cut your skin, okay? Just tell me when you feel it," he said. Todd knew that he didn't have to actually cut the skin to initiate the program. It was different in each model. He wondered what this one would do. He pressed the blade down slowly. David didn't understand what the big boy wanted. He was trying to be friendly and fun, so he would let them play. The blade was pressed against his arm. He felt it pressing harder as the big boy watched him curiously. Then David felt the warning feeling. The feeling that meant he should pull his arm away. But the big boy wouldn't let go. The boy pressed the blade harder against David's soft inner arm. David wondered what the boy was trying to. A sudden mad rush of information ran up David's arm and exploded into his head. A message flashed inside David's head. A bolt of life-preserving energy came with it. His head jerked up, his eyes opened widely. The sensitive light apertures in them opened to maximum for brightness and clarity.
"Safety alert! Run!"
his brain announced, telling him to seek out something, someone, anything familiar. "Keep me safe, keep 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 me safe." David began to chant as he scanned the crowd for a familiar face. His legs were bent to run, his outer features that of a terrified child. This was designed to alert adults in the vicinity that something was wrong. But the adults couldn't see what was happening in the press that fascinated boys. Martin heard David make a strange whining sound. What were they doing to him now? He turned. He heard the mecha boy chanting something low under its breath. The other boys backed away. Uh-oh, Todd had screwed up this time. But Todd was mindless of the trouble he'd initiated. He watched, fascinated as the little mecha looked around, its head making swift robotic jerks. This was way cooler than the serving man back home. Images of safe people were indexed before David's inner eye. There was Mommy, Henry, and... Martin saw David's eyes lock on him. "Hey, what'd you guys do?" he asked. Then David quickly sprinted at him and hid behind his back, grasping him about the waist, pinning his arms against his side, and stepping away from the threat, stepping away from the big boy with the danger in his hand. "Keep me safe, Martin. Keep me safe. Keep me safe." His litany was a blur of excited whispers into Martin's ear as he attempted to move to a safe proximity from the dangerous boy. Some of the adults saw what was happening now as David and Martin stepped backwards out of the cluster of curious boys. But they did not know the nature of the situation and presumed it was a game. Martin struggled against the mecha's grasp. "Hey, let me go!" he yelled. What in the hell was this damn thing doing now? Its arms were too strong. It dragged him backwards. "Get off of me! Mom! Mom!" he yelled. The robot held him tightly, backing him away from Todd and the other boys. But it was backing him towards the... Suddenly Martin felt a loss of balance, and the sky rotated and disappeared as he was taken into the water, gripped tightly by the safety alarming robot. His mouth filled with water, his nose filled. He could not breathe. Monica had been talking to Grandma Swinton when her little boy's voice had come across the yard. What were they up to now, she wondered. She had warned them not to tease David. She looked around just in time to see Martin jump into the water with another boy. He wasn't supposed to go into the water yet. What was he doing? "Martin!" she called out. She ran to the edge of the pool, and through the deep blue she could see the two boys. Who was that? Oh my God! "Henry!" she screamed. "Henry!" They were drifting down into the cold blue haze. The filtered glow of the sun and the warbling silhouettes of the people by the pool receded quickly above them. David's fiber-metallic infrastructure and flesh-stimulating silicone exterior did not have the buoyancy of a real boy's body, so they plummeted straight to the bottom. Martin could hear David's muffled chant through his own growing terror. Henry was standing with one of his friends from Cybertronics when he heard Monica call him. What now? He turned and saw Monica's terrified face and a group of boys pointing into the water. Some of them jumped in excitedly. But where was Martin? Where was his little boy? Henry rushed for the pool, his friend following quickly on his heels. He ripped off his shirt and dove into the water. Martin was no longer struggling. The dangerous boy was up at the poolside. He had not followed them into the water. Some other boys had jumped in, but had stayed near the surface. David felt safe now. The water was an all-encompassing pressure. It hugged him, coddled him. There was no strain on his limbs, no need to stand or bend or walk. Then he saw the men come into the water. The mecha was strong, stronger than Henry had anticipated. They attempted first to lift the boys out together, but their combined weight and the robot's lack of buoyancy made it too difficult. Life-saving seconds were passing. They tore at the robot's arms, they punched at its face, but the blows were softened by the depth. Fortunately, they had not initiated the safety sequence again, which might have made it impossible to open David's arms. They'd fought and struggled with it until finally it had let Martin go. The boy was not moving. No air escaped his mouth. The men pushed off the bottom and flew Martin to safety. David watched the men rush out of the water with Martin. One of them had hit him in the face. He'd realized then that they wanted Martin and had let him go. David could still hear them with his special ears. They were excited. Someone was calling Martin's name over and over. It was Mommy's voice. She said, "Breathe, breathe," and she made the crying sound. Then He saw them stand as one and walk away as if they carried something together. Were they going to come for him too? He waited and waited. The water had calmed now. David was engulfed and embraced by it. It held him aloft, and the soft currents caressed the sensitive receptors in his skin. There was no weight here, no inertia that his limbs need accommodate, no hurt or confusion. He felt he could stay here for a long time. It was peaceful. His mind seemed to work better in this quiet place. Gradually, a thought that had been forming in his head took shape. It pressed into form from the tremulous clutter of emotions that had befallen him since Martin's arrival. It had something to do with the fairy tale that Mommy had read. He felt a sudden need to explain this to her. But still no one came for him. Something had gone wrong, but he did not know exactly what. He reached his arms up, out to the distant sky that danced softly above him. His fingers extended outward, grasping at the image that would burn forever in his brain.
Mommy,
he whispered into the cold blue. Teddy had watched the adults pushing on Martin's chest, and Henry had put his mouth against Martin's. But Teddy knew this was not a kiss. He did not want to get in anyone's way, so he stood back from the commotion. Then the adults rose as one with Martin's still form and rushed into the house. This was bad. When they left, Teddy walked to the side of the pool. He gazed into the water. David was in there. He was reaching up, reaching for something. Teddy could see the look on David's face. His mouth moved, as if he was calling out to someone. Teddy was not a sophisticated robot. He played, he alerted, he protected. But in that instant, he realized that David was not a toy, that there was no place for David in his index. He stood by helplessly until Henry and some other men came to take David out of the water. David was in his room where Henry had left him. The man had seemed angry, but he'd been polite when he gave David the bathrobe and took away the wet swimming trunks. He had told David to stay then until they came for him. David had taken this opportunity to draw some words. While he was in the water, he had understood something new that he had not known how to express. The words, he hoped, would express this thought that had come from his new mind. He drew slowly, letting his feelings take their shape in the words he created. David had just finished his last note when he heard Mommy come into the room. He put down the crayon he'd been writing with and rushed excitedly to see her. "Mommy!" he cried as he reached out to embrace her. Monica caught David by the shoulders. Her face was set and grim. She could no longer deny Henry's observations. Martin had been taken to the hospital. He'd be okay. Thank God he'd be okay. But his lungs were too soon out of stasis to handle the flood of water, and he had to be placed under observation. He'd live. They'd assured her of this, but everything else had changed. Monica held the excited Mecca at bay. I need to speak to you for a minute, okay, David?" "Okay, Mommy." He ran obediently back to his bed. Monica looked over her shoulder. Henry was waiting by the door. His face was set, determined. "Get this over with, Monica," is what that look said. She turned away from him. That look was accusing, and she felt guilty enough already. Had she missed this all along? This conflict that had been growing between Martin and the Mecca? She walked to the bedside, but she couldn't sit down. There was no turning back now. She knew that. David was either malfunctioning, or the imprinting was causing some unpredicted reaction in his brain. She never had a chance to talk to Martin's friends about the incident by the pool. She never heard about Todd's abuse of David. In the excitement, this crucial piece of information had been overlooked, forgotten. "David?" she started. But David wasn't looking at her. He was smiling, his eyes set on the desk near the window. She followed David's gaze and saw there a neatly stacked pile of scratch paper. The first one had something written on it. It was in crayon and written in precise lettering. She looked at him. He was smiling up at her now. His face gleamed with the expectant look she had seen 1,000 times since she'd awakened his love. He had something to show her. Monica walked to the tidy stack of papers and picked them up. She flipped through them. "Mommy, how are you today? I'm fine and I love you. Teddy's helping me write to you." Monica's heart dropped. What machine could write such things? "I love you and Henry and Martin, and Teddy too. And the sun is shining." By what process did a machine realize these feelings? From whence did they come? "I am our real son, but not Teddy. I hate Teddy. He's not real like you, David." Monica felt her tears building. She could read no more. "I am our real son, and Martin too, but not Teddy." She had a job to do, and she had to do it now. She placed the papers back down and wiped her eyes. "These are beautiful, David," she said weakly, not looking at him. She couldn't look into that innocent gaze, not just yet. She calmed herself. "Thank you," she said. She walked to the mecha boy and sat down on the bed next to him. This was a mistake. He was too real from this close. She saw Henry waiting by the door. Beyond that door lie responsibilities. Her family. Her son's future. Her life. "David, I was thinking," she started slowly, "that maybe we could go for a drive tomorrow, in the country." She looked at his smooth, innocent face, but she quickly looked away. It was a simulation. She had to remember that. A simulation. "Just you and me, David. What do you think?" she asked. "And Teddy?" David asked excitedly. "Sure," Monica agreed. "Teddy." She couldn't look at him. She knew he was beaming with childish joy. She held back the emotion that threatened to overcome her. Then she felt the little boy's arms wrap around her. He was warm. Was he alive? Dear God, he can't be alive. She steeled herself against the feeling of this little embrace, this tender, loving grasp that had once saved her heart. "Thank you, Mommy," David whispered in childish reverence, his tender face pressed against her bosom. In the secret place in his brain, her image burned with a radiance like never before. "Thank you so much," he whispered. Monica heard the words and pulled her heart back from them. She sat quietly and let her little boy enjoy this last tender moment between them. Soon enough, his troubled brain would be silent. He would be beyond the pain and confusion with which this awful process, this imprinting, had cursed them both. She looked out through the window as he gripped her tightly. Time passed. The night was falling. The last rays of light glowed weakly against the insistence of the looming darkness above. Her betrayal had begun. David could see the sky rolling by quickly in between the overhanging branches of the trees. He was curious and expectant, wondering when they were going to stop. Teddy sat in David's lap, and the old machinery in his neck whirred and clicked as he watched the landscape roll by. Mommy had been strangely silent. David gazed at her, not believing he was alone with her, hoping this moment would last forever. "Where are we going?" he asked conversationally. Mommy continued to drive silently. Some more of the road passed by. "Someplace nice?" he asked when she did not respond. Monica wished he would be quiet. She was bracing herself for that moment of truth, that last moment when they would lead him away. Would he cry her name? Would they have to struggle with him as she left, leaving him to his doom? Mommy's face was tight, and her lips pressed closed. There was no expression to read, but David saw something in her eyes. "Are those happy tears?" he asked. And what would she see in their eyes? Those technicians that would put her soft-hearted metal son to sleep forever. David was just a machine to them, right? Would they smile apologetically as they fought to tear him away from her? As he struggled against their grasping hands? Would he know? Dear God, would he know what was happening? Please don't let him understand. Mommy was not responding. Had he annoyed her like Teddy said he did sometimes? Maybe he should try to change the subject. What's for dinner tonight? David asked, hoping that would break her silence. There was no turning back. She pushed her chin up and drove faster. You know that you don't eat, she replied finally, punctuating each word. David was glad to hear her voice, but there was reservation there. Yes, he acknowledged, but I do like sitting at the table. Then suddenly, they had arrived. End of line. Unceremoniously, the Cybertronic statue rolled into view, its outstretched arms pronouncing its place a point of no return. Beyond that point, nothing could ever be undone. All transactions were final. David saw the statue too, and something struck him familiar. He knew that shape. Mommy must know it too, because she slowed down and stopped. He heard her make a sad sound, and he forgot the statue as he eyed her curiously. Why was she sad? Had he made her sad somehow? Monica could not go there. Her foot would not press on the accelerator. What were they expecting her to do? Kill her son? Is that what they thought she was going to do? David was pressed back into his seat as Mommy suddenly accelerated and sped past the statue. She raced along the road, her face displaying some conflict unrecognizable to him. He tried to ask her what was wrong, but she told him just to be quiet. She had to think. She didn't know how many kilometers had passed, or how much time she had driven since seeing the Cybertronics access road. She stopped finally. All around them, the lush forest pressed in against the road. She needed space. She needed time. She needed to think. Damn it, she just needed some time. Then she saw a path to the right of the road. She looked at it through tear-streaked vision. A thought came to her. Yes, she realized, that was the only way. She turned quickly down the forest road and retreated into the shadows. When Mommy stopped under the thick lining of trees, David grabbed Teddy and the blanket and jumped out excitedly. He would find a place for them to sit so he could watch Mommy eat. He ran a short distance until he found a clear spot and placed Teddy against a log. Then he happily unraveled the big blanket that they would use to sit on. Teddy scanned their surroundings. It was dark and damp, and the ground was mossy. He knew this was not a good place to sit and eat. Something was wrong. Monica hurried after David. She had to explain things to him now. Please let him understand. She saw him then, through the trees, an unsuspecting metal boy in the shadows of the forest. She watched him try to unfold the large blanket, struggling with it as a quick breeze arose and blew it over his head. She could not take him to his death, and she could not take him back to the only home he had ever known. This was the only way. She forced herself forward. David, she said softly. He was still struggling with the blanket, still not comprehending anything. Hold on, David, she said, and pulled the blanket from over his head. She tossed it on the ground. Not understanding the gesture, David went to the ground to smooth the blanket so she could sit. David, listen, she commanded, kneeling beside him. He looked up at her, his smiling face betraying only the slightest confusion at her desperate tone. She could see that he loved her so. Wasn't there some programming command that would just make him walk away? Some string of words that could magically turn off this maddening love? And what then? About her heart? Listen, she said softly. You won't understand the reasons, but I have to leave you here. David gazed at her quietly, his eyebrows closed in a simulation of childish puzzlement. She could imagine the processor in his head working. "Is it a game?" he asked with a smiling realization. She fought tears. "No," she said finally, winning the fight. David did not understand this. Mommy was going to leave him here? Why? Some new urgency was beginning in the back of his mind. "When will you come back for me?" he asked hesitantly. The urgency was getting closer to the surface. She steeled herself. She had to be strong now. I'm not coming back, David. You have to be here by yourself." "There," she said it. "Please let that be it." "Alone?" he asked in a quavering tone. She could see he understood now, but it was far from over. "With Teddy," she whispered. "Please let that be enough, David," she thought. "That's all I have to offer you." David gazed at her silently. She didn't know what was happening behind those puzzled eyes. She only knew her own heart had already been broken. David thought about this. He was going to be alone? Alone? The urgency arrived then and spilled out of him. "No, no, please, Mommy, no." He whined, and his voice raised in a child keening that was impossible to refuse. He reached for her, but she pushed his hands away. "You have to understand. They're going to destroy you, David. Destroy you. Please let him understand." But David's keening only increased, and he grabbed for Monica as she rose to flee from him. She couldn't do this. She hadn't asked for this. She couldn't love him anymore. "I have to go," she yelled, her voice breaking with emotion. "Mommy! Mommy!" he called out, chasing her as she fled to the car. "Don't call me that," she thought. Her tears flooded her vision, and her legs went weak. David caught her then, and his eyes were moist. Monica gasped. Was it crying? Why would they program something like that? David held tightly to her wrist. His eyes were wide with fright. The thing he wanted to tell her came out then, the thing he had thought about in the pool. "Mommy, if Pinocchio became a real boy, then I can become a real boy too, and then I can come home." This was the worst piece of savagery yet. The fairy tale. He had taken the fairy tale to heart. "It's just a story, David," she yelled, pulling herself free. "But a story tells what happens," he said. Couldn't she see? Monica had to get away. "Stories are not real, David." She ran quickly for the vehicle. David pursued her, insisting loudly that indeed stories were real. "Yes, Mommy, he knew they were real." He caught her at the car, but only because something had dawned on her. She firmed up and faced him again, yanking her arm free as he desperately tried to grab at her again. Her weakness would do neither of them any good. "Listen to me," she commanded, reaching into the pocket of her vest. She pulled out a wad of nubucks and forced him into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Take this, and don't let anybody see how much you have." She pushed his grasping hands away and knelt before him. "Don't go that way. Don't look at me. Look over there," she yelled, pointing in the direction of the Cybertronics building. "Don't ever go that way, or they'll catch you. Don't ever let them catch you, David." Her tears threatened to consume her again, but she fought them down. "Please don't ever let them catch my pitiful little boy," she thought. "Stay away from flesh fairs, David. Stay away from groups of people. Stay away from all people. Stay only with others like you, David. Only Mecca are safe." She was finished now. She looked away before his eyes bore into her soul. But he grabbed her around the neck before she could rise. "I'm sorry I cut your hair, and I'm sorry I broke myself, Mommy. If you let me, I'll be so real for you. So real." He cried over and over. If she would just let him try. He knew he could do it. He knew he could. She couldn't do this anymore. "Let go!" she roared, and threw him to the ground. He lay there shocked, staring at her. The impact must have caused him override in his panic. Or maybe he was finally realizing that it was ending, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Monica saw the look on his face. She almost ran to see if he was okay. But the look stopped her. In its way, it was worse than the pleading. His eyes had gone blank, empty at the realization that there was no mercy she would allow him. Was this the last look of the condemned before the final stroke? She fled then, her heart ragged and choking in her throat. At the car door, she turned to him one last time. "I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the world." And then she was inside the cruiser, fleeing that world she had neglected to explain, locking the doors and pressing the accelerator, ignoring the sound of small hands beating against the window, ignoring the heartbreaking cries that were muffled by the clatter of branches and brush hitting the side of the car. Ignore the mirror, too, her heart told her. Don't look back. Don't look back. But she did look into the mirror, and that last image would stay with her for the rest of her life. Refusing to go away, it would burn into her mind and slowly burrow its way into her soul. She saw the helpless silhouette fade into the gloom of the forest. The little imitation boy whose real love had saved her ability to feel, to love. Now he stood alone. As she watched, his head dropped to one side in uncomprehending resignation. She sped away faster and faster, sped away from the pain, from the shame, from the guilt that she would never be able to escape. Her betrayal was complete, but it would never be over.